Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise today in the House to speak for the second occasion on our important work to update our intellectual property regime and more specifically to combat counterfeit products, Bill C-8. Mr. Speaker, this is not just a modernization of our IP regime here in Canada, but a bill that will have major impacts on public safety, on economic activity and revenues, and on jobs, because counterfeit products not only lead to risk for Canadians, but lead to job losses. Our present legal framework for intellectual property, Mr. Speaker, is also incredibly out of date. Like many areas, our government is moving on important issues of public policy while other previous governments preferred to kick the can down the road. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Trademarks Act was last amended in the 1950s and is out of date, before many members of this House were born, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't, with respect to trademarks, even recognize the current state of intellectual property. Mr. Speaker, a few years ago I had the good fortune to have a column in Marketing Magazine, and in 2012 I wrote a column on the emergence of sound trademarks in Canada. And it might interest this House, especially on a Friday, to know that sounds in the U.S. had been trademarked for some time. We are all familiar with the NBC TV broadcast chime that started with radio and is on television. And we all know the MGM lion roar. Well, the MGM lion roar is now a sound mark, Mr. Speaker. In 2012, the Canadian Intellectual Property Office allowed for the first time a sound mark. And you'll look at a lot of our big companies and a lot of big brands will use a sound to associate a connection with that brand. In the marketplace, it's called a sound mark or a sting, Mr. Speaker. Even the language of the Act is being modernized from using the old term wares and now the more broad and modern term goods. The landscape has changed, Mr. Speaker. Sounds, colors, three-dimensional shapes, textures, and even taste are a critical part of a brand's identity. And companies, employers in Canada, spend millions of dollars securing these brands and this intellectual property. Speaking of colors being associated with brands, Mr. Speaker, I can't resist to note that the color blue is widely known to associate with strength and trust, while the color red is considered boisterous and flashy. I think these differences between blue and red illustrate the differences between Conservative leader and Liberal leader perfectly. C-8 will also enable IP rights holders to stop counterfeit goods at every step in the process. Ports, distribution, retail. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned at the first time I rose to speak on this subject many years ago, for 5 years I was in-house corporate counsel at Procter & Gamble in Canada. And in 2006, I was confronted with the ugly face of counterfeit goods in my job as a lawyer for that company. I assembled a brand protection team with the support of the company president, Tim Penner, and my general counsel, Eric Glass, our head of security, a proud OPP veteran working for P&G, Rick Cotwa, and a regulatory scientist, Jennifer Casabon, who was in this gallery earlier today, Mr. Speaker, with her daughter, Maya. We put together a team to investigate and stamp out counterfeit goods that were affecting that company, not only affecting its revenues, its investments in Canada, and its jobs, but affecting potentially the safety of people that buy products because they trust the brand, they trust the logo, they trust the trademark. This bill, C-8, will allow rights holders like Procter & Gamble and like other companies to stop counterfeit goods throughout the criminal activity used to bring them to consumers' homes. This bill will provide better tools to investigate commercial counterfeiting and help reduce trade in counterfeit goods by promoting new enforcement tools to strengthen our current enforcement regime. The Act provides new criminal offenses that criminalize the commercial possession, manufacture, or trafficking of counterfeit goods or trademarked counterfeit goods. It will also create new offenses for trademark counterfeiting and equipping the law enforcement and prosecutors with the right tools to actually stamp out this problem. This act will also give border officials, CBSA, the authority to detain suspected shipments and contact the intellectual property rights holders about their brands and their rights being attacked. The Act will allow Canadian businesses to file a request for assistance with Canadian Border Services Agency, in turn enabling border officials to share that information with the rights holders regarding suspect shipments. Mr. Speaker, this bill is yet another example of our government consulting widely with employers and key stakeholders and listening. These changes and protections and new enforcement mechanisms are what industry and rights holders have been demanding for over a decade, Mr. Speaker. And increasingly, our well-trained and professional workers at CBSA have also been asking for these tools to do their job better and more efficiently, Mr. Speaker. It's also important to note in the subject of counterfeit goods that criminal networks around the world are actually feeding on counterfeiting as a highly lucrative profit to help fuel other enterprise. And we know these international criminal networks throughout the world bring tremendous harm and oppression, not just here in Canada, but around the world, and the proceeds from these IP crimes fuels that. In 2005, Mr. Speaker, the RCMP declared organized crime to be the primary actor in this area of malfeasance. Stamping out counterfeit products and IP crimes starves these criminal networks of funding and starves them of the ability to hurt. The public safety elements of C8 are also very important and deserve highlighting, Mr. Speaker. The bill will give border officers additional tools to work with their government partners at Health Canada and the RCMP. This will ensure that unsafe or unsanitary products that could harm Canadians are pulled from the market. In my case, Mr. Speaker, Procter & Gamble found that law enforcement could tell them they knew there was a suspicious activity regarding one of their brands, but there could be no tracking, there could be no proper investigation, and really, Mr. Speaker, there'd be no prosecution because the tools were not there. So law enforcement, busy as they were, would have other priorities that were more likely to lead to criminal charges and jail time. Mr. Speaker, I hope we can move ahead quickly with the passage of this bill by protecting consumers and families and by encouraging business through innovation, through protecting their brands and encouraging them to invest in Canada. These amendments not only promote innovation and creativity, they help stimulate job growth, Mr. Speaker. In my situation, while I was at Procter & Gamble, Mr. Speaker, this one employer in Eastern Ontario was the largest private sector employer in the communities of Belleville and Brockville. Important investments in manufacturing jobs in an area of our province that's chronically unemployed, has chronic unemployment. These companies around the world, large companies, estimate losses in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars due to the theft of the goodwill surrounding their brands. The Canadian Anti-Counterfeiting Network, leading Canadian employers, brands, academics, have all been asking for us to update our intellectual property regime in Canada, Mr. Speaker, and provide law enforcement with the tools to stamp out these products that not only will lead to job losses, but that fuel crime and actually pose health risks to Canadians across the country. So I truly hope, Mr. Speaker, that all my friends in this House will recognize there's been a decade of asking for this, and with our government, we're delivering, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Question and commentary, l'honorable député.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Beauharnois-Salaberry. Microphone, please.
Parlementaire de l'autre côté pour dire que c'est un pas dans la bonne direction pour se Yes, Bill C-8 is indeed a step in the right direction because tools will be given to CBSA agents. However, can the member opposite tell us what financial resources, what additional manpower is going to be given to the CBSA, since the national president of the Union of Immigration Officers said that additional costs would be in the order of $143 million to implement the legislation, and that as it now stands, additional resources will have to be given in order to better fight organized crime, drug trafficking, child porn, and other such things. So what additional financial resources will be deployed? We still haven't received an answer in committee, so I hope that the member opposite can clarify that aspect.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for that very good question. My perspective, having worked in the private sector on this for one of the largest brand owners in the world, Mr. Speaker, is that industry has actually been working with law enforcement and border officials on training, on preparing for having this registry and these rights. So actually, this is an area that the active participation and partnership with IP rights holders will actually save money over time, because this is the expertise of the people that own the marks, that made the texture, that made the sound, training and working with our professionals at CBSA in a way that will make their operations more efficient and give them tools to move quickly, Mr. Speaker. So this is actually a terrific case where CBSA will get the tools they're asking for and partner with IP rights holders who are affected to save Canadians from the risks of counterfeit goods, while also making it more efficient and saving money, Mr. Speaker.
Right on. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hail from the Western GTA, and my neighbours work in communities like Oakville and Burlington and Mississauga and Brampton. And they're primarily concerned with good-paying jobs, jobs that will pay for the mortgage, allow them to provide benefits to their families. Perhaps the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary can tell us specifically how this legislation will actually improve the lives of working Canadians in the GTA.
Very good question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for that very good question, because this bill is actually for job and economic promotion in Canada. Her area of the province of Ontario, Mississauga and Brampton in particular, that larger area, is the highest concentration of headquarters of Fortune 500 companies in Canada. These companies invest in our country, manufacturing goods here, distributing goods here, selling goods here. Their intellectual property rights have been robbed for years. And Canada has actually been identified over 8 years ago by the U.S. Trade Representative as a country that is not equipping its borders and does not have the IP regime to stamp out this crime. And we were on a list, Mr. Speaker, with countries in the Middle East and in other parts of the world that don't recognize IP, Mr. Speaker. So this is actually bringing it up and ensuring that these companies and brands that invest in Mississauga, that invest in the GTA, keep their investments flowing and keep jobs being created, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming.